Let me go back now to what I was getting at a little bit, but it's related to this early period in Vienna too. I was very pleased to hear you say earlier that you attribute a good deal of your subsequent thinking in political philosophy, political theory, to this insight that you gained in economics and knowledge, or that was expressed first in economics and knowledge. This whole notion, as you mentioned a minute ago, of the fictitious data of the economist, as you know, there has been a big upsurge within the last decade in this country of the Austrian economics group, centered around sort of subjectivist notions of economics. As you know, I got into the periphery of this in some work on cost and subjective nature of cost and so forth. And in rereading some of that literature, the central contributions were, of course, your contributions made during the period you were at London, along with several of your London colleagues. What I'd really like to ask you and have you to talk to me about would be, to what extent did this sort of notion of the subjectiveness of economics, of the subjectivity of economic choice, to what extent did that come down to you through the Austrian economist, or to what extent was that part of this economics knowledge illumination that you felt at that time?
Well, I believe I derived it directly from Menger's original work. I don't think there's much of it in the later Austrians. Nor Mises moves around it, and he's the real founder of the American School of Austrian Economics. I mean, the American School of Austrian Economics was very largely a Mises school. And he had great influence on me, but I always differed, first not consciously and now quite consciously. Mises was a rationalist utilitarian, and I am not. He trusted the intelligent insight of people pursuing their known goals and rather disregarding the traditional element, the element of surrounding rules. He would even, no, he wouldn't accept legal positivism completely, but it was much nearer it than I would be. He would believe that the legal system, no, he wouldn't believe that it was invented. He was too much a pupil of Menger for that. But he still was inclined to see it as a sort of rational construction. I don't think the evolutionary aspect, which is very strongly in Menger, was preserved in the later members of the Austrian school. I must say, till I came really. In between, there's very little of it.
Well, you mentioned the evolutionary aspect, but what I was really getting at more was the sort of subjectivist aspect, the subjective dimension of choice, which is very clear in your pieces.
I think I would almost say I have put the same thing in entirely different form. If the decisive factor is the knowledge and attitude of individuals, the particular question of preferences and utility becomes a minor element in the individual action and habits being the driving element. That we must, to me, subjectivism really becomes individualism, methodological individualism.
Oh, sure, I think that's right. I agree. One man whom I have been reading a good deal of this year, and who was at the LSE at that time, more or less as an older student, I would suspect, is Shackle. Did you know him very well?
I've discovered Shackle.
Yes. I have sort of discovered him too. He's very good.
No, I mean, I discovered him in a very literal sense. Shackle sent to me, when he was a schoolmaster in South Wales, an essay he'd written. Nobody knew him. I encouraged him to elaborate it for Economica. And then he came on a visit to London, and I've never seen a man greatly more moved, because he was speaking for the first time to a live economist. which seems to have been a great experience in his life. And I was very impressed and got him a scholarship at the London School of Economics. And we've ever since been on very friendly terms, and I followed his development with great interest. I think he's a first-class mind.
I find him to be grossly neglected amongst
I
economists.
entirely agree.
Because his material on choice under uncertainty and to me there's much in that has not been digested at all by the profession.
You know, there's a very curious disagreement between two younger men of LSE who don't see eye to eye on this John Hicks and Shackle. I don't know why, but they move on parallel but completely not converging ways, and both, I think of the other that they have done a rather harm.
Well, I'm interested to get that story about Shackle because I met him once and I found him to be a fascinating man, and his book Epistemics and Economics is I think a great book.
He's still very active thinking. I traveled with him in Spain a year ago and we lectured together.
Let me shift a little bit, if I may, to ask you something on a slightly different topic. I remember reading a piece that you wrote in Encounter about, maybe a decade ago, in which you talked about two kinds of mind.
Oh, yes. I know that.
And maybe you could tell me a little more about that.
It's a very old idea of mine, which as I explained in the beginning of that article, I never wrote it up because it would sound so frightfully egotistic about speaking about myself, why I feel I think in a different manner. But then, of course, I found a good many instances of this in real life. The first observed instance of other people was the relation between Böhm-Bawerk and Wieser, who were of these two types. The one, when I call the master of his subject, who is complete survey of all his subject does, who can give you a prompt answer about what is the answer of current theory to this and this problem. Robbins is another. In fact,
which one, Böhm-Bawerk or Wieser? Which one was which?
Böhm-Bawerk was a master, master of his subject. Wieser was a much more commonly would think intuitive thinker. And then later in life, I know two types who are typical masters of the subject, and who, because they have the answer for everything ready, have not done as much original work as they would have been capable. The one is Lionel Robbins, the other is Fritz Machlup. They are both to an extent command the present state of economics, which I could never claim to. But it's just because I don't remember what is the standard answer to a problem, I have to think it out anew, that occasionally I get an original idea.
Jacob Weiner you'd put in that first camp too.
Oh yes. Or I think Weiner and Frank Knight are another instance of the same contrast.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And in philosophy, Bertrand Russell and Whitehead. Bertrand Russell, typical master of his subject. Whitehead, I think himself has described himself once as a muddlehead, on the same ground that he didn't have the answers ready.
So you have to start from scratch, in other words.
No, but on a with a sort
you start rethinking the problem.
With a sort of vague background map, which is not very precise, but which helps you finding the right way, but it doesn't. The right way isn't clearly marked on it.
Yeah, I think I get the point. Let me ask you your relationships, or did you know, or how close were you to Michael Polanyi? Did you know him very well?
Yes, he was for a few years my colleague in the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago. And there was one interesting relationship. For a period of 10 years, our mind happened to move from the same problem to the same problems. Our answers were not the same, but for this period we were always just thinking about the same problems. So it very interesting discussions with each other. I liked him personally very much. I think again he is a somewhat neglected figure, much more Well, I think he suffered from the usual thing that if you leave your proper subject, the other people regard you as an amateur in what you're talking about. But he was in fact very competent. I would almost say he's the only non-economist I know who wrote a good book on economics.
Well, he was probably influenced then by you in that logical liberty material.
Not much. He knew a little about my ideas. We had a meeting in Paris in 1938, I believe, organized by the philosopher Rougier, called the Colloque Walter Lippmann. It was occasioned by Lippmann's Good Society book. And that's when I first encountered Polanyi, and then we had some very interesting discussions. But some of the essays in the Logic of Liberty were already written by that time. The book appeared later. But as I say, our mind moved on parallel courses, frequently giving different answers, but asking the same questions.
Well, I asked you whether or not you thought your notions had influenced Polanyi. Let me ask a question a little more generally. Amongst prominent thinkers, who are the men you think you have influenced most?
I have
influenced, yes.
Well,
or maybe that's an embarrassing question. Maybe I shouldn't have asked that. But
it's not embarrassing. I just don't know. I would have to think. I mean, Shackle, whom I mentioned before,
yeah,
is
of
one
course,
I'm convinced
yeah.
I have had great influence on him. I'm discovering to my pleasure now that many of the very much younger generation, the men in their 30s, seem to be greatly influenced. But among the older generation, I mean, the people who would now be in their 50s or 60s, offhand, I can't think of
I don't think there's any question of the group at London. Shackle and Ronald Coase, surely his ideas on cost had a
Ronald
big...
Coase probably too. You know, had a curious influence on Hicks. You won't believe it, but I told him about indifference curves. He was a pure Marshallian before.
Yeah.
And I remember the conversation after a seminar when he had been talking in Marshallian terms that I drew his attention to Pareto and Edgeworth. It was the very beginning of the 30s, of course.
Well, to go back to the Austrians again, were you actually a student of Bombarwerk and Wieser?
No, Bombarwerk not. Bombarwerk died in 1915 when I was 16.
I see.
I happened to know him as a friend of my grandfather and a former colleague at Innsbruck and a mountaineering companion of my grandfather. But when I saw him, I had no idea what economics was because I was too young. I was a direct student of Wieser, and he originally had the greatest influence on me. I only met Mises really after I had taken my degree. But I now realize, I wouldn't have known it at the time, that the decisive influence was just reading Menger's Grundsätze. And I probably derived more from not only the Grundsätze, also the Methodenbuch, not for what it says in methodology, but what it says in general sociology. I mean, this conception of the spontaneous generation of institutions is worked out more beautifully there than any other book I know.
Did you know Max Weber?
No.
Never.
Vienna was full of his influence when I came back. You see, he had taught in Vienna in the spring of 18 when I was on the front. He had gone to Munich that summer, and I came to university absolutely full of his influence. I must say all the girls were speaking about him because there had been hardly any boys at the university then. And my hope had been, in fact, a promise from my father that if I got my degree very soon, I could go for a year to Munich to study under Max Weber. But before it was possible, he died, so it never came off. But there must have been in the atmosphere there very great Max Weber influence. Of course, I only read his stuff when his main book came out, which must have been 1921-22. He had very close contacts with Mises, incidentally, during that short period when he was in Vienna.
You think there's much lasting influence of Weber's ideas?
I doubt it.
Yeah.
On some points, he's clearly wrong. I think the most famous thing about the Calvinist sources of capitalism, I believe he's completely wrong. And even beyond this, I rather believe that what is lasting is probably what Schütz has taken over. But I must confess to my shame that I've never studied, although he was a close friend, he was one of our Vienna circle. I've never studied Schütz's work carefully. I always intend to someday.
I know Fritz Marklopp has told me about that, and I've felt the same way that I should do it, but I've never really done it. I'd like to go back a little bit to this thing that you alluded to, one time that you alluded to earlier, namely the time in the 30s and this debate on the socialist calculation between Lange and Lerner on the one hand and Dickinson and Mises and yourself and others on the other. Looking back on that debate now, it's hard for some of us to believe that people could have been quite so naive as people like Lange were, to think that an economy could be computed in that sense.
But he really believed it. At least in the case of Lerner, I'm absolutely certain. He was somewhat more sophisticated. Lange, I came later a little doubtful whether he was really intellectually completely honest. When he had this conversion to communism, as communism came to power and was willing to represent his communist government in the United Nations and as ambassador, and when I met him later, he had at least been corrupted by politics. I don't know how far he had already been corrupted in the 30s when he wrote these things, but he was capable of being corrupted by politics.
But you think some of people, it's hard for, at least for me, to recreate the mindset of those type of people who could...
Dickinson was an absolutely sincere and honest thinker. I have no doubt about him. He was a bit naive, that I will also concede, but he strongly believed that these things he described would be possible. Perhaps a little what the Germans call weltfremd.
I remember when you visited Charlottesville, we prevailed on you to give a very interesting short discussion of your relationships with your cousin, Wittgenstein.
Oh, yes.
I doubt if anyone else in these interviews are going to take that up, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that here.
Well, you know, I've recently published an encounter paper of my recollection with Wittgenstein. I can't say I knew him well, but of course I knew him over a much longer period than anybody now alive. My first recollection goes back to a day on furlough and leave of absence from the front, where on the railway station in Bad Ischl, which you probably know in the Salzkammergut, two young ensigns in the artillery in uniform looked at each other and said, "You're a fairly familiar face," and one of us asked the other, "Aren't you a Wittgenstein, aren't you a Hayek?" I now know that at this moment, returning to the front, he must have had the manuscript of Tractatus in his rucksack. Of course, I didn't know it at that time. But many of the mental characteristics of the man were already present as I gathered in this night journey from Bad Ischl to Innsbruck, where the occasion was his contempt for the noisy crowd of returning young officers, half drunk, a certain contempt for the world. Then I didn't see him for a long time, but I heard a lot about it because his oldest sister, eldest sister, was a close friend of my mother's. They were second cousins and came frequently to the house, and there were little rumors constant about this crazy young man, and she strongly defended Wittgenstein, and that's how I heard about him. But I came to know him only fairly well, much later in Cambridge. I met him there before the war. I saw him in the later part of the war when he returned. But we did really never talk philosophy. I have a strong impression of the kind of personality. The last discussion I had with him was a discussion on politics. We were both returning from Vienna, but I had broken the journey in Bâle and stepped into a sleeping car at midnight in Bâle, and it turned out that my companion in the sleeping car was Wittgenstein. And all the first half of the following morning, we were, as soon as he had finished his detective story, we were first talking about Vienna and the Russians in Vienna, and it led to talk about general philosophy and ethical problems. He was bitterly disappointed what he had seen of the Russians then. And just when he became interested, we arrived at the port for the ferry, and although he said we must continue this, he apparently regretted having gone out of himself, because on the ship he was not to be found, and I never saw him again.
Speaking of Vienna, I remember, I guess it was in the 50s, you were telling me once about a project you had to get a lot of money, as I remember it was the Ford Foundation.
Yes.
To reestablish the University of Vienna back in the...
Well, it establishes tradition. The idea was to create something like an Institute of Advanced Studies and bring all the refugees who are still active back to Vienna. I mean, people like Schrödinger and Popper, and I had a marvelous list. I think we could have made an excellent center if the thing could have been financed. But what grew out of it is the present Ford Institute in Vienna, which I devoted entirely to mathematical economics and statistics, of which I don't particularly approve. I think the plan miscarried, not least because the University of Vienna did not display great enthusiasm for such a scheme.
Not quite completely, because I'm going over in March to that institute to give some lectures. But to the political scientists, you'd be interested to know, not the economists. You're quite right about the economists.
I believe, grown. I mean, when I was there once about 15 years ago for part of a term, well, it seemed to consist entirely of econometricians.
I think the economics people pretty much that way, that's right. But the political scientists are interested in public choice.
Maybe, and probably personnel has changed almost completely since.
Yes. Well, I really am straying a little bit from this whole topic of political theory, and I suppose we should try to get back on that topic somewhat. But I did want to bring in this Wittgenstein connection, because I thought that would be an interesting interlude in the conversation.
Well, I perhaps ought to add that I did, because I knew him, or knew the family, read the Tractatus almost as soon as it came out, and I was familiar with thinking long before it was generally known. But that is really early acquaintance with his work rather than personal acquaintance with the man.